Dear friends, let us discuss about the corpus callosum. You have heard of white matter of cerebrum. The white matter of cerebrum is divided into the association fibers restricted to one hemisphere only. So connecting the adjacent areas of one hemisphere where you call it as the short association fibers, and if they are connecting the cerebral hemisphere distant areas, then you call it as the long association fibers. So that means association fibers are restricted to one cerebral hemisphere. Then the second type of fibers are the commissural fibers that connect the two cerebral hemispheres, the similar areas of the two cerebral hemispheres, that you call it as the commissural fibers. And then there is the projection fibers which connect the cerebral cortex with the lower areas, that is in relation with the brainstem, the spinal cord, so that are running through them. They are called the projection fibers. Now we will discuss about the commissural fibers, and the best example for the commissural fibers is the corpus callosum. Let us see what is the corpus callosum. It is the largest commissure of the brain and it forms an arched band. If you see this section, this is the medial surface of cerebrum, wherein you can see a arched band of fibers, and this is the corpus callosum, and it is located in the median fissure. Median longitudinal fissure is there that separates the two cerebral hemispheres. So in the floor of that median longitudinal fissure, you will be seeing the corpus callosum, and the length of corpus callosum is about 10 centimeters. It contains nearly 300 million fibers. So it's white matter, that you have to remember, and it connects almost all areas of cerebral cortex. It is connecting except the visual area, the primary visual area, that is area 17 nearer to the occipital pole, and then the somesthetic areas connected with the hand and foot, that is areas 3, 1, 2, that is in the postcentral gyrus. And if you see in this image, the corpus callosum has a convex upper surface, and the other white fiber which you are seeing is the fornix, commissure of the fornix we call it. Now let us see the parts of corpus callosum, and you can see this is the anterior end and this is the posterior end. So anterior end of it is called the genu and the posterior end of it is called the splenium, and in between is the body of the corpus callosum, and from the anterior end, that is from the genu, there is a prolongation which you can see going on to the inferior surface, and this is called the lamina terminalis part, wherein and the part of corpus callosum that is extending from the genu is called the rostrum. So the anterior end is the genu, which is 4 centimeters from the frontal pole, and its prolongation to the upper end of lamina terminalis is the rostrum. Then the central part is the body of the corpus callosum or trunk of the corpus callosum, and the posterior enlarged part, bulbous part, is the splenium, and the splenium is about 6 centimeters in front of occipital pole. So now we have seen the parts of the corpus callosum, and this is an easy diagram which you can draw without difficulty. Now let us see the relations of the corpus callosum. It has got an upper surface. The upper surface, this is the one. It is covered by a thin sheet of grey matter which is known as the indusium griseum. This is the grey matter, indusium griseum, which is nothing but rudimentary dorsal hippocampus. And we are seeing the lines. These are called the medial. We are seeing the two medial longitudinal striae and the two lateral longitudinal striae. So this is what you will see on the upper surface of the corpus callosum. Then this upper surface, it forms the floor for the medial longitudinal fissure of cerebrum. So which contains the free lower margin of the falx cerebri. So you know, falx cerebri is a sickle-shaped fold of dura mater having a two margins, superior margin containing the superior sagittal sinus, and this inferior margin of it is in contact with the upper surface of the corpus callosum and it contains the inferior sagittal sinus. Then if you see on each side, see again the medial surface. So this is the corpus callosum. On each side it is related, the upper surface, this is the upper surface which is related to a gyrus known as the cingulate gyrus. Cingulate gyrus, and it is separated from the cingulate gyrus by means of a sulcus. So this sulcus which you are seeing between the corpus callosum and cingulate gyrus is the callosal sulcus. Callosal sulcus. And what does it contain? It contains the anterior cerebral vessels. The anterior cerebral vessels, the anterior cerebral artery is the main artery, or the major contribution of the anterior cerebral artery is to the medial surface. Now let us see the relations of the lower surface of the corpus callosum. This is the lower surface of the corpus callosum, and if you see the anterior part of it is, you are seeing the septum pellucidum which separates the corpus callosum from the body of the fornix. And if you see posteriorly, you are seeing the two crura of the fornix. The body of the fornix will be divided into two posteriorly underneath this splenium, and they are called the crura of the fornix, that is related to the lower surface of the corpus callosum. On each side, the septum pellucidum is lined by ependymon of the lateral ventricle. So the septum pellucidum is the partition separating the two lateral ventricles, and here you are seeing a foramen that is called the interventricular foramen of Monro, through which the lateral ventricles communicate with the third ventricle. There is what is called a transverse fissure. Where is it located? It is between the splenium, this is the splenium, and this is the superior colliculus of the midbrain. So between the two, and there is the pineal gland also. So there is the transverse fissure. So what does it contain? The tela choroidea, the fold of pia mater of the third ventricle and lateral ventricle extends through this gap, and it transmits the posterior choroidal arteries that will enter it, and leaving it will be the internal cerebral veins that leave the transverse fissure, and these veins they join to form great cerebral vein of Galen. So which is also, that is the transverse fissure is also a relation for the corpus callosum. Now let us look at the blood supply of the corpus callosum. So the rostrum, the genu and body are supplied by the bilateral branches of the anterior cerebral artery in the form of anterior pericallosal artery, subcallosal and medial callosal arteries. Whereas the splenium is supplied by branches posterior cerebral arteries. So known as the posterior pericallosal artery. So why we should know about the blood supply of corpus callosum is the possibility of infarcts of the anterior cerebral artery and posterior cerebral artery affecting the blood supply of the corpus callosum. Corpus callosum contributes for the lateral ventricle. Let us see the contribution of it for the lateral ventricle. So what you are seeing is the corpus callosum, the body, genu, and then the rostrum of it. This is the splenium and this is the fornix. And you are seeing a opening because of the removal of the septum pellucidum. So you can see the cavity of the lateral ventricle, and this probe is passing through the interventricular foramen of Monro into the lateral ventricle. So what is the contribution to the lateral ventricle? The trunk, it forms the roof of central part of the lateral ventricle and anterior horn of the lateral ventricle. The genu will form the anterior wall of the ventricle, whereas the rostrum will form the floor of the anterior horn of the lateral ventricle. So now we have learnt about the contribution of corpus callosum to the lateral ventricle. We all know that corpus callosum is a band of white fibers that connect the corresponding parts of right and left hemispheres. So let us see what are those parts that are interconnected. And anteriorly is the genu, and its continuation down is the rostrum. So the rostrum will connect the orbital surfaces of the frontal lobes. Whereas the genu, this is the bend, this is the genu, it interconnects the two frontal lobes by means of a fork-like bundle of fibers which are known as the forceps minor. And if you see this is the trunk or body of the corpus callosum. So the fibers of this trunk will be running transversely and they intersect with the vertically running fibers known as the corona radiata. Part of these fibers of the trunk and the adjacent splenium, so which are not intersecting with the corona radiata, they form what is known as the tapetum or the lid. Tapetum fibers that form the roof and lateral wall for the posterior horn and lateral part of roof of inferior horn of the lateral ventricles. So they are forming the roof for the posterior horn and inferior horn of lateral ventricle. And if you see the fibers of the splenium, they are interconnecting the occipital lobes of cerebrum by means of a fork-like bundle of fibers known as the forceps major. Anteriorly is the forceps minor. This is the forceps major fibers. And the fibers of forceps major, they produce an elevation in relation with the medial wall of posterior horn of lateral ventricle, bulb of the posterior horn we call it. So now you know how the corpus callosum interconnects the identical parts of the right and left hemispheres in the form of fibers known as the forceps minor and the tapetal fibers, the forceps major fibers. Now let us see the functions and clinical importance of the corpus callosum. It is involved in transfer of learning for motor expression, because the primary function of corpus callosum is to integrate the sensory, motor and cognitive information from the homologous association areas in the two cerebral hemispheres. So it's involved in the transfer of speech from left brain to right brain before 8 years of age. Then, so what are all the areas that are involved in this speech is the area 22, area 39, area 40 and the motor speech area of Broca, area 44 and 45 in relation with the inferior frontal gyrus. So what is the clinical importance of corpus callosum? So sometimes it can be absent right from the birth, this for congenital absence, or it can be surgically resected. For example, in severe cases of epilepsy. So when it is absent, the two cerebral hemispheres are not connected. So there is split brain. So if one hand is trained to perform an act, the other hand may not be able to do so. So which you can test. So if you are able to do a exercise or a manual with your right hand with your eyes closed, and you will be able to repeat the same with the left hand, though you have not observed what your right hand has done because your eyes are closed. This is possible because of the corpus callosum. And if it is absent, so what one hand is trained to perform will not be able to be performed by the other hand. So now you have understood what is corpus callosum and what is its important and what type of fiber it is. So it's an example of commissural fiber, largest commissural fiber. The other commissural fibers being anterior commissure, posterior commissure, and habenular commissure. The hippocampal commissure through the fornix, which we have seen. Then the corpus callosum itself is the largest commissure.